Static hum crackles through the speakers, sharp, uneven bursts of sound, as if clawing for clarity. A voice breaks through, strained, breathless. It's layered with distortion, fragments fighting to be heard. This is Commander Elias Varen of Europa Station. We're under siege, systems failing, shadows in the ice. Don't let it out. The voice cuts off. Silence follows, hollow and stretched, broken only by the faint whine of interference. Then, static fades, replaced by the steady rhythm of breathing, a voice calm but deliberate. Europa Station. Officially designated E46. 2,000 colonists, engineers, biologists, geologists, specialists in ice drilling and oceanic exploration, sent to establish the first permanent settlement beneath the frozen crust of Jupiter's moon. The colony was a marvel of engineering, self-sustaining, shielded from radiation, pressurized habitats carved into the ice, linked by reinforced tunnels that extended toward the subsurface ocean, a dark, alien sea buried 70 kilometers below. Scientists called it humanity's greatest leap into the unknown. But 29 days after touchdown, the transmissions changed. Routine reports became erratic, shorter, fragmented. The final message came from Commander Elias Varen. It lasted 48 seconds. This message, I've analyzed it, cleaned up the distortion, amplified the lower frequencies, but the anomalies remain. The recording begins with heavy breathing, muffled voices in the background, panicked, shouting orders. Then Varen's voice cuts through. This is Commander Elias Varen of Europa Station. We're under siege, systems failing, shadows in the ice. Don't let it out. The signal drop. Noise floods the channel, like the hum of machinery echoing through water. Then, silence. Rescue teams arrived 32 days later. By then, the base was dark. The landing pad was intact. The airlock sealed. No signs of forced entry. From orbit, thermal scans detected power signatures and environmental stability. Inside, they found no one. 2,000 people. Gone. Workstations still active. Equipment calibrated. Meals half-eaten. It was as if the colony had been abandoned mid-breath. The first recovery team lasted 16 hours. They retrieved mission logs and video feeds before losing contact. Their last transmission was a single word: retreat. The second team didn't enter. They detonated charges along the tunnels, collapsing the main corridors before leaving the surface. Europa Station was sealed, declared unsafe for further exploration. The official cause? Structural failure. But the logs tell another story. I've studied them. Decrypted fragments, voice recordings, surveillance footage corrupted beyond recognition. Patterns emerged, frequencies embedded in the data, repeated sequences buried in the static. The more I listened, the harder it became to separate noise from signal, patterns from voices, and then words. The station isn't just silent. It's listening. And if the files are to be believed, something is still alive beneath the ice. What you're about to hear is everything they tried to bury. The final records of Europa Station, recovered from its depths and sealed for 20 years. The truth doesn't end with the disappearance of 2,000 people. It begins there. My name is Dr. Kaelen Rhodes. For over 2 decades, I've worked as a forensic analyst specializing in deep space incidents, cases the public never hears about, the ones buried under layers of redacted reports and sealed archive. I first came across the Europa files 12 years ago. At the time, they were flagged as a systems failure, equipment malfunctions, structural collapse, 0 survivors. That was the official explanation. It's what I believed. Until the files resurfaced. Hundreds of hours of audio logs, mission records, surveillance footage, and something else, encrypted data fragments recovered during a salvage operation. Information that wasn't supposed to exist. It was classified before I ever saw it. And when I did, the pieces didn't fit. The Europa mission began with optimism. It was humanity's first step toward permanent colonization beyond Earth. 2,000 colonists, scientists, engineers, terraformers, selected to build Aquarius Colony beneath the frozen crust of Europa. They called it a new frontier. The colony sat above the subsurface ocean, 70 kilometers below the ice, an isolated sea kept warm by volcanic vent. It was the most promising location for extraterrestrial life we'd ever found. Or so we thought. Construction took 18 months. Crews built interconnected habitats, pressure-sealed corridors and domes buried deep enough to shield against radiation but close enough to access the ocean. They drilled shafts into the ice, created thermal conduits, and lowered exploration pods into the waters below. The colony's research focused on one objective: cataloging biological anomalies. 3 weeks after arrival, they reported success. They found life. Microscopic organisms suspended in thermal current. Alien ecosystems thriving in the darkness. The discovery redefined what we thought possible, and for a brief time, the colony became the center of scientific attention. Broadcasts from Europa filled the networks. Interviews, footage of research teams in submersibles, images of bioluminescent organisms drifting in black water. And then, the transmissions stopped. Day 29. Communications fell silent. No updates, no explanations, just static. The relay satellites continued transmitting carrier signals, but no data followed. At first, it was written off as interference. Jupiter's magnetosphere often disrupted transmissions. But when contact wasn't restored after 24 hours, emergency protocols activated. Rescue teams were prepped. Probes were launched. None of it helped. Orbital scans showed the colony intact. Power signatures were stable. Radiation shields were holding. But there were no heat signatures, no sign of movement, no bodies. Just empty corridors and sealed doors. The first team to land reported nothing unusual at the entry site. The airlock responded to external commands. Systems were operational, atmosphere stable, and yet the station was silent. I've read their logs. They described the halls as still, not abandoned, not damaged, just still, as though something had pressed pause. Ladders left extended, meals half-eaten, lights dimmed but functional. And then they found the control room. Screens still flickered with readouts. Station vitals, pressure levels, oxygen reserves. But the system showed anomalies. Doors locking and unlocking out of sequence, thermal vents rerouting without commands, security cameras turning themselves on and off. And then the logs changed. The lead investigator wrote that it wasn't what they saw that disturbed them. It was what they heard. Sounds carried through the corridors, mechanical hums, faint echoes, and something else. Low vibrations, almost like breathing, pulsing through the walls. The team pulled data from the colony servers and prepared to leave. They never made it back to the shuttle. Their last transmission was a single word: retreat. It was followed by 30 seconds of static and a burst of distorted noise. Then silence. The second team arrived 5 days later. They didn't go inside. Instead, they collapsed the entry shafts, sealed the tunnels, and detonated charges along the corridors. They destroyed the entire structure, an operation later labeled as environmental containment. But if it was containment, the files don't explain what they were containing. They don't explain why the colony was left buried under millions of tons of ice, or why no further missions were authorized. What's left of the data paints a different picture. Buried in encrypted logs are fragments of conversations, distorted, broken, overlapping voices recorded during the colony's final hours. They talk about shadows moving through the tunnels, doors locking behind them, figures that looked human but weren't. One voice repeats the same words over and over. Don't let it out. Europa Station was more than an experiment. It was more than exploration. And whatever they found under the ice, it didn't leave. I've spent years piecing this together, and I'm still not sure what they uncovered. But I know this much. The mission didn't fail because of structural damage. It failed because the colonists triggered something. And whatever it was, it's still there. Europa isn't just silent. It's waiting. I wasn't supposed to see the files. Not all of them. The report I received, the one marked for public disclosure, was 72 pages long, dense with technical jargon and environmental data. It concluded that Europa Station suffered a catastrophic systems failure, irreparable damage to life support systems, structural collapse, and total loss of personnel. The kind of language designed to end questions before they're asked. The final page contained a brief memorial, a list of names 2,000 long. No photograph, no personal details, just names, dates of birth, and empty spaces where dates of death should have been. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. What the public never saw, what I wasn't supposed to see, was the classified archive. Thousands of files locked under Level 5 clearance, decrypted only once, years after the station was sealed. I requested access under pretense, analyzing deep space system failures for infrastructure resilience. I expected engineering diagrams, corrosion data, radiation assessment. What I found were pieces of something else entirely. The first file was audio, unmarked, heavily compressed. When I cleaned up the distortion, the voice came through. Flat, strained. A man reciting an inventory list, except halfway through, the words stopped matching the database. 12 units oxygen, 7 units nitrogen, 4 units water filtration, 26 eyes, 13 hands, 16 ribs. It doesn't finish. Other recordings followed. Fragments of conversations, interrupted by static and layered with faint echoes, voices overlapping like they were speaking from different rooms but recorded on the same microphone. When I slowed one down, I heard my first clear sentence. It watches when we sleep. The second set of files came from security footage recovered by the first rescue team. Most of it was corrupted. Video feeds cut to static after a few seconds, replaced by time stamps that didn't match the logs. I scrubbed through frame by frame until something caught my eye. It was a corridor, empty at first. Then a figure entered the frame, wearing the standard environmental suit issued to the colony's maintenance teams. They moved slowly, dragging one foot behind them. Then they stopped, turned toward the camera. The helmet visor was cracked, and inside, nothing. The frame cut out. The rescue team's logs described similar encounters. Doors opening and closing without commands, equipment activating by itself, and strange shadows cast by light fixtures that hadn't been powered on. Their reports were erratic, rushed, as though written in haste. One log described a chamber found deep within the station, past the excavation tunnels. It wasn't listed on the blueprint. The walls were covered in frost, and in the center stood what they described as a column of ice, roughly 3 meters tall. It was hollow. The last video feed showed them approaching it. And then the camera shut off. No bodies were recovered. Only their shuttle remained, docked and pressurized but empty. The final files weren't recordings. They were biological scans, biometric data pulled from the colonists' medical implant. The implants were designed to monitor heart rates, oxygen levels, and neural activity. They transmitted readings every 15 minutes. Most of the data was routine, gradual acclimation to Europa's gravity, elevated stress levels during excavation. But on day 29, the patterns shifted. Heart rates spiked. Blood oxygen dropped. Neural activity became erratic. Some implants flatlined. Others continued transmitting for hours after the final distress call. The strangest readings came from 10 individuals. Heart rates dropping below measurable levels, but neural activity continuing, spiking as though they were in REM sleep. I flagged these files for further analysis. Within 24 hours, my access was revoked. All inquiries were rerouted to higher clearance. No explanations were provided. But I had already seen enough. The colony didn't die from equipment failure. The damage wasn't sudden. It unfolded over days. Slow, deliberate, almost methodical. I've studied anomalies before, false signals, corrupted data, software glitches. But this wasn't noise. These were patterns. Patterns that repeated across multiple systems, multiple sources, converging in ways that shouldn't be possible. And the readings didn't stop when the colony went dark. For weeks after the station was sealed, Faint signals continued to transmit, heartbeat rhythms, neural pulses. Weak, but constant, until they faded. Or so I thought. 2 months ago, those signals came back. The readings are weaker now, scattered across multiple frequencies, as if something's struggling to hold them together. But the pattern is the same. It's identical. I've tracked the source. It's still coming from Europa. And it's still active. The colony logs began with optimism, confidence, the kind of measured excitement you expect from pioneers, people standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. The first entries spoke of progress, drill teams cutting through ice layers faster than expected, temperature readings confirming geothermal activity below, samples from the ocean showing complex organic chains, signs of life, proof they weren't alone. Day 4. Engineer Hannah Voss recorded an update during her shift in the excavation chamber. Her voice was steady, professional. She described the ice strata, how it shifted in subtle ways as they drilled deeper. Patterns emerged, alternating layers of density that couldn't be explained by natural processes. Her words, not mine. It's almost like someone built it, she said. At the time, no one took the comment seriously. They filed it under unusual geological formations and moved on. Day 6. Biologist Raj Mehta's log detailed their first encounter with bioluminescent organisms. He called them ghost filaments, thin strands that drifted through the water, glowing faint blue. They pulsed in rhythm with the thermal vents, almost like they were responding to the current. Mehta speculated they might rely on chemical signals, clustering in patterns to exchange nutrient. He sounded fascinated, hopeful. But by day 10, that optimism had begun to erode. The logs shifted. Entries became shorter, more fragmented. The tone changed. It started with the lights. Electrical teams reported fluctuations, brief flickers along the main corridors and in the hydroponics dome. At first, they blamed faulty wiring. A simple problem, easy to fix. But it kept happening. Lights dimming and brightening out of sequence. Systems rebooting without warning. Day 12. The first unexplained seismic event. Miners reported vibrations echoing through the tunnels. Steady, rhythmic pulses that didn't match drilling activity. Sensors failed to register the source. The tremors lasted 11 minutes before stopping. Raj Mehta logged his observations after the event. He described how the ghost filaments reacted, clustering together in dense swarms near the drilling shafts, their light intensifying. He speculated the vibrations might be triggering some kind of chemical response, stimulating movement. But he couldn't explain why. Day 15. Hannah Voss recorded a private log. Her voice was quieter this time. Uneasy. She described hearing sounds through her comms. Voices, faint but clear enough to make out word. Except no one else was on the channel. She replayed the recordings and heard nothing but static. She wrote it off as interference, equipment errors caused by the ice shifting. Later that night she filed another log. She hadn't slept. She swore she heard the sounds again, this time without the comms. It's in the walls, she said. I can feel it. Day 18. The second seismic event. Larger this time, prolonged. The vibrations knocked equipment out of alignment, cracked several support beams, and forced the excavation teams to halt drilling. Emergency lights activated. Security footage captured the event, workers evacuating the tunnels, alarms blaring, dust falling from the ceiling. But something else was caught in the recording. A shadow. No identifiable source. It passed through the corridor as the tremors hit, but nothing matched its dimensions. No equipment, no crew members. It moved too fast. Day 19. The logs thinned out. Entries became terse, short status updates instead of observations. Security officers began conducting hourly patrols. Teams doubled their shifts, working through the night to reinforce damaged areas. Drilling slowed to a crawl. On day 20, the logs stopped entirely. No explanations. No entries. Just silence. The only records that remained were fragmented, audio clips buried in corrupted files. I played them one by one. The first was faint, barely audible. Footsteps echoing in an empty corridor. The second was worse. Breathing. Closed. Labored. Like someone struggling for air. It lasted 43 seconds before cutting out. The third file was different. It was Raj Mehta again. His voice trembling, words rushed. They're watching. I don't know how, but they're watching. They know we're here. Then static. The final recording was the longest. Came from Hanavaz. She wasn't alone. I could hear others in the background, voices overlapping, arguing. She was trying to calm them. Her words were clear, but there was something else underneath her voice. A faint hum. Low, steady, almost mechanical. It's not the ice, she said. It's not the water. It's deeper than that. We drilled too far. We woke it up. The log ended with a single line of text. Timestamp. No voice attached. Seal the doors. Don't let it out. Day 21. The logs changed again. Entries grew shorter, fragmented. Words clipped and rushed, like the people recording them were speaking between breath. Most of the entries were marked incident reports, but the descriptions felt incomplete, like pages had been torn out. They weren't documenting the mission anymore. They were documenting something else. The first report came from the engineering crew working the southern shaft. They were tasked with reinforcing the tunnels after the seismic event. The log described a technician, Aaron Pike, leaving his station to retrieve tools from the storage bay. He never came back. Security footage shows Pike walking down the corridor toward the storage bay. He scans his ID at the door. The lock disengages. He steps inside. But the footage never shows him leaving. No alarms triggered. No emergency signals. Just the door closing and the system resetting, as if nothing happened. The audio from Pike's comm recorded something strange. A faint tone, constant, barely audible. It started the moment he entered the storage bay and continued for nearly 5 minutes. Then it stopped. That was the last transmission from Pike's suit. By day 23, Pike wasn't the only one missing. 2 more technicians vanished. One in the maintenance sublevels, another in the hydroponics dome. Both incidents were identical. No alarms. No evidence of struggle. Tools left behind, meals unfinished. The colony ran automated sweeps for life signs. They found nothing. The logs became erratic after that. Crew members filed complaints about doors locking and unlocking by themselves. Habitat controls rerouted oxygen to storage rooms instead of living quarters. Water filtration pumps shut off without warning, leaving the hydroponics dome dry for hours before the system corrected itself. By day 24, paranoia had taken hold. The colony's doctor filed a report detailing elevated cortisol levels and abnormal neural activity in more than half the crew. Sleep cycles collapse. Workers complained of vivid nightmares, shapes moving through walls, shadows pooling in corners. Security footage from the central corridor captured one technician, Elena Ramirez, standing motionless outside the command room for 40 minutes. She didn't respond to calls over the comm. She didn't move. Just stood there, staring at the door. When security finally intervened, she collapsed. Her biometric readings were erratic. Heart rate elevated, oxygen levels dropping. She survived, but she couldn't explain why she had gone there or why she didn't leave. The next breakthrough came on day 25. Excavation teams working in the lowest tunnel uncovered something buried beneath the ice, what they described as a structure. At first, they thought it was a cave, a natural formation carved out by geothermal current. But as they cleared away more ice, patterns emerged. The logs were rushed, their descriptions incomplete. The structure was circular, its walls smooth and reflective, like polished stone. Engineers took measurements, perfect symmetry across every surface. The readings showed traces of carbon and silicon, but the density didn't match any known mineral. They widened the shaft, exposing more of the structure. That's when they found the first openings, narrow passageways leading deeper inside. Teams sent drones to map the chambers. What came back was inconclusive. The drones lost signal after moving beyond visual range. Each time, the feeds ended with the same distortion, an oscillating hum that overpowered the audio. By day 26, the crew stopped calling it a cave. They started calling it a machine. The logs described walls that shifted, patterns moving under the surface, pulsing in slow wave. Engineers theorized it was some kind of reactive material, responding to temperature or pressure. But then the readings changed. Heat signatures spiked inside the structure. Movement sensors detected vibrations, pulses that matched the patterns seen in the bioluminescent organisms pulled from the ocean below. The colony's lead geologist, Dr. Evelyn Marks, recorded a private entry that night. She sounded exhausted, afraid. "It's not rock," she said. "It's growing." The log ended abruptly. No follow-up. But the next morning, Dr. Marks was gone. No one saw her leave her quarters. Security logs showed her keycard was never used. But when they searched the excavation site, her boots were found just outside the tunnel. The colony's command team held an emergency meeting. The logs showed discussions about shutting down the dig site and sealing the tunnels, but no decision was recorded. Instead, the logs shifted again, shorter entries, broken sentences. They talked about sounds coming from the walls, the hum growing louder, people waking up in places they didn't remember going to. One log recorded faint tapping noises inside the structure, rhythmic, like signals. Some described it as mechanical, others said it sounded like breathing. By day 28, the colony stopped logging discoveries. They stopped logging anything. The last coherent entry was from Hannah Voss. Her voice was shaking, but she kept speaking. She talked about the structure, how it wasn't just embedded in the ice. It extended deeper, farther than their instruments could scan. "We've only uncovered the surface," she said. "It's not just one structure. It's connected like veins. And it's awake." She paused for nearly a minute before ending with one final note. "We shouldn't be here." Day 29. The logs pick up again, but only for a short time. The entries are disjointed, recorded in bursts as if the colonists were documenting events while they unfolded. There's no preamble, no explanations. Just voices, hurried, strained. It started at the excavation site. The team had widened the shaft, exposing more of the alien structure. They described it as a chamber, a hollow space surrounded by what looked like fused layers of stone and metal. Patterns covered the surface, too precise to be natural, and the walls seemed to shimmer when touched, as if reacting to heat. The crew brought in scanners, ultrasound, LiDAR, but the readings didn't make sense. Signals bounced back distorted, warped, or didn't return at all. Then the machines started failing. Battery drains, hardware malfunctions. Engineers replaced the equipment 3 times before resorting to manual tools. They cut through the outer surface of the chamber, documenting the process step by step. The final logs from the excavation team recorded the moment they broke through. The chamber opened with no resistance. The cut edges smoothed themselves almost instantly, as though the material had healed. Inside, the space was vast, larger than their scans had suggested, the walls curving inward toward what they described as a core. The core wasn't solid. It pulsed. Faint light moved across its surface in ripples, like bioluminescence seen in deep-sea creatures. One engineer compared it to a heartbeat. The moment they stepped inside, the logs recorded a shift. Environmental readings spiked. Magnetic interference overwhelmed the instrument. The light inside the chamber flared, blinding the cameras. And then the logs cut out. What came next is fragmented, recovered from backup systems days later. The first clear entry was an emergency broadcast from the colony's command center. Commander Varen's voice: "Power failure. All systems down. We're evacuating to secondary modules. Repeat, abandoning primary habitat." The recording crackled, breaking apart under interference. Background noise filled the channel. Alarms, footsteps, voices shouting orders. Then another voice came through, almost drowned out. "The tunnels, seal the tunnels. Don't let it follow." Static swallowed the rest. The logs continued in pieces. The colonists retreated to the lower levels, secondary modules built closer to the thermal vent. They carried emergency lights and portable heaters. The primary habitat remained intact, but power wouldn't return. Backup generators overloaded one by one, cutting off oxygen circulation. Within hours, the colony was in darkness. The logs described what followed in fragments. Engineers worked to restore power, but the systems wouldn't respond. Airlocks opened and closed at random. Pressure seals refused to engage. Security sensors triggered alarms that couldn't be traced to any source. The colonists moved deeper underground, searching for safety. But they weren't alone. Audio clips recovered later captured sounds that no one could explain. Rhythmic pulses, low and mechanical, echoing through the tunnels. Scraping noises against metal doors. And something else, static bursts layered with patterns that resembled speech, but no language anyone could recognize. By day 30, most of the logs stopped. The last few entries came from personal recorders, colonists documenting their final hours. One described lights flickering in the distance, appearing and disappearing like signals. Another spoke of voices calling out from the tunnels, voices they recognized but couldn't have been real. Then the logs ended entirely. The final recovered entry came from Commander Varen. His voice was faint, his breathing shallow. He spoke in broken sentences, pausing between words. "We opened it. We woke it up. It's not a machine. It's not dead." The recording cut off mid-sentence. The timestamp placed it less than 2 hours before the rescue team arrived. But when they entered the lower modules, they found no one. No bodies. No signs of evacuation. Just empty corridors and scattered equipment. Lights still flickering. Air still circulating. As if the colony had been abandoned moments earlier. I've studied the logs for years, trying to make sense of the gaps, the missing hours, the corrupted files. But there's no pattern. No trail to follow. The only consistent detail is the electromagnetic pulse. It didn't just shut down the systems. It altered them. It rewrote security protocols, rerouted power distribution, and blocked external signals. It was deliberate. I don't think the colony discovered a machine. I think they found something alive, something waiting beneath the ice. And when they opened that chamber, it woke up. The data ends there. The logs are incomplete, fragmented. Whatever happened after the final recording, whatever happened to the colonists, was erased. But the signals didn't stop. 2 months after the mission was declared a failure, orbital scanners picked up faint transmissions coming from beneath Europa's surface. Patterns buried in static. Pulses too regular to be random noise. They matched the colony's original frequency. The official reports dismissed it as interference, but the signals didn't fade. They've continued for 20 years. And now they're getting stronger. The recovered visual logs were pulled from the colony's emergency storage drives. Isolated backups that survived the electromagnetic pulse. Most of the footage was degraded, broken into fragments. Video feeds flickered with distortion, faces blurred by data corruption. But some clips were intact. Enough to reconstruct what happened during those final hours. The first recording came from the central corridor. Time-stamped 20 minutes after the blackout. The lights were already failing, casting long shadows against the walls. Colonists moved through the frame, carrying flashlights and portable heaters. Their movements were hurried, uneven. Some paused, turning back as if they'd heard something. Others pressed forward without looking up. A man stumbled into view, barefoot, wearing a maintenance jumpsuit. His name tag read Keller. He wasn't part of the excavation team. He was assigned to hydroponics, far from the dig site. But his uniform was wet, covered in frost. He stopped in the center of the corridor, staring directly into the camera. Then he turned and walked out of frame. When the team searched the area later, there was no trace of him. The next clip showed the excavation chamber. Grainy, the edges blurred by interference. Flashlights swept across the walls, catching glimpses of the patterns etched into the surface. One beam lingered on a fissure in the ice. It pulsed, faint, rhythmic light spreading outward like veins. A voice broke through the static. Commander Varens? Keep moving. Stay together. The camera turned, catching movement in the distance, shadows along the edges of the chamber. At first, they seemed like reflections, distorted by the uneven surface of the ice. But they didn't move with the lights. They shifted independently, bending and stretching as though alive. Someone yelled. The camera spun, and the feed cut out. The next recording came from a body cam worn by Security Officer Lena Parrish. Her breathing was heavy, her footsteps echoing through the narrow tunnel. She stopped suddenly, the camera shaking as she turned. In the distance, something moved, just beyond the edge of the light. She whispered a name. Aaron. The technician who'd gone missing days earlier. Her voice cracked. She called out again, louder this time. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, half hidden in the shadows. Then it stepped closer. The face was pale, distorted by frost and darkness, but the features were familiar. It looked like Aaron, but the eyes were wrong. They reflected the light, flat and empty. Parrish started backing away, her breathing sharp. The figure stepped closer. Then the light cut out and the recording ended. The footage that followed was worse. Hallways strewn with scattered tools. Storage bays emptied as if ransacked. Lights flickering in and out, casting sharp angles that made the shadows move. A clip from the security station showed 3 colonists gathered near the main console, whispering to each other. One of them, the station's engineer, was holding a thermal cutter, the blade active. He turned suddenly, pointing it at the others. His lips moved, but there was no audio. The others tried to back away, but he didn't lower the cutter. The recording ended before the confrontation played out. By the time the footage resumed, the security station was empty. The logs described what came next. Hallucinations, paranoia, colonists hearing voices through the comm channels, voices that sounded like crew members who were already missing. Some refused to leave their quarters. Others tried to seal themselves inside the lower modules. Then came the journal. It belonged to Dr. Evelyn Marks, the colony's biologist. Most of her notes were focused on the microorganisms found in the ice, the ghost filaments described in earlier logs. She speculated they were symbiotic, thriving within the thermal vents but dependent on something deeper beneath the surface. Her later entries took a different tone. She described patterns in the samples, how the organisms reacted to electrical impulses, mimicking neural activity. When exposed to light, they clustered together, forming shapes that resembled dendrites, the branching structures of nerve cells. She wrote about their ability to adapt, to mirror signals. Her final entry was a hypothesis. She believed the organisms weren't passive. They were reactive, capable of recognizing patterns and projecting responses, like a biological feedback system. But the part that stood out wasn't her analysis of the samples. It was what she wrote next. They learn, she said. They copy us. The logs stopped after that. The rest of the data was corrupted. Layers of interference that made the words impossible to recover. I've replayed the footage dozens of times, looking for explanations. The shadows, the movements, the faces that shouldn't have been there. The colony didn't just uncover alien life. They uncovered something capable of observing them, mimicking them, and once the systems failed, there was nothing left to stop it. The colonists retreated into the tunnels, deeper into the ice. But whatever they'd found, or whatever had found them, was already inside. The rescue team's logs described the corridors as undisturbed. No blood, no signs of struggle, just empty rooms and scattered equipment. But the footage tells a different story. It wasn't an evacuation. It was something else. The colonists didn't leave. They were taken. The final recordings recovered from the colony's database came from the last rescue attempt. 6 crew members sent to investigate what remained of Europa Station. Their mission lasted just over 16 hours. Only 12 minutes of usable footage survived. The video begins inside the excavation tunnels. The walls are layered with frost, smooth in some places but cracked and uneven in others. The rescue team's lights cut through the darkness, beams bouncing off the ice and casting long, distorted reflections. The air is filled with a low hum, constant, mechanical, but faint. None of the crew mentions it. None of them even seem to notice. The team moves deeper, passing empty supply crates and scattered tools. The tunnels branch off in multiple directions, but they stay together, following the markings left by the original excavation crews. Their footsteps echo faintly, swallowed quickly by the walls. At 8 minutes in, they reach the chamber. The footage shifts, blurry at first as the camera adjusts to the sudden change in light. The chamber is enormous, larger than any of the logs described. The walls pulse faintly, as though light is moving beneath the surface, rippling like currents through water. The patterns are there too, flowing in and out of focus, shifting as the team moves. The first thing they see is the column. It rises from the center of the chamber, smooth and translucent. Crystalline. Its surface reflects the light, but something inside casts shadows, shapes twisting slowly, overlapping. At first, the team doesn't speak. They just stand there, staring. Then one of them steps closer. The camera follows, and the shadows inside the column sharpen. The shapes resolve. Bodies. 5 figures, suspended in the crystal. Their limbs are bent at odd angles, pressed against the surface as if trying to push their way out. Their faces are turned upward, eyes open, mouths slightly parted. One of the rescue team whispers a name. Raj Mehta. It's him. His face. His uniform. But the expression is wrong. There's no fear. No pain. Just stillness. Then another crew member points out the others. Hannah Voss. Elena Ramirez. Commander Varen. All accounted for. All preserved. But not frozen. Not lifeless. The camera zooms in. Their eyes are moving, slowly, tracking the light. And their mouths are moving too. No sound comes through the footage, but the motion is deliberate, like they're speaking. The rescue team starts panicking. Their voices rise. Arguments about cutting the colonists out, about activating the emergency beacons. One of them touches the column, and the pulsing light intensifies. The hum grows louder. The camera glitches. Static ripples through the footage, then stabilizes. And that's when the voice comes through. We are one. It's Varen's voice. Calm. Steady. But wrong. Too smooth. Too even. The team freezes. The voice continues. The ice remembers. The hum swells, vibrating through the chamber. The light inside the walls pulses faster, matching the rhythm. The bodies in the crystal shift. Their mouths still moving, faster now. Desperate. Like they're screaming. The recording cuts to black for 4 seconds. When it comes back, the team is gone. The chamber is empty. The column still stands, but the shadows inside have changed. The figures are gone. The camera pans slowly across the walls. Patterns ripple outward from the crystal, spreading as if alive. And in the center of the room, the floor begins to move. The ice splits, revealing something deeper, an opening dark and shifting. The footage ends there. The rescue shuttle returned to orbit 6 hours later. The flight logs show no distress signals. No mention of the missing team. The shuttle was intact. No signs of damage, but the cockpit was empty. The pilot's seat was vacant. The airlocks were sealed. And the beacon was still transmitting. I analyzed the final data bursts sent from the shuttle before it disconnected. Buried in the telemetry were fragments of audio, distorted, overlapping voices. Most were unrecognizable. But one came through clearly. It was Varen again. We are one. The ice remembers. The signal repeated 3 times before cutting out entirely. I've replayed those words over and over, comparing them to Varen's earlier logs. The vocal patterns match, but the inflections don't. It's his voice, but not his speech. Not his mind. Something else was speaking through him. I've tried to explain it. Patterns in the data, distortions caused by magnetic interference, but nothing fit. The signal shouldn't exist. The rescue team shouldn't have vanished. The colony shouldn't have been empty. But the chamber was real. The column was real. And the voices haven't stopped. Last month, the same pattern. Varen's voice, appeared on a deep space relay. Faint, fragmented, echoing the same words. We are one. The ice remembers. The signal came from Europa. The footage raised more questions than it answered. The patterns, the pulses, the voices, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Every signal, every malfunction, every failure in the colony's systems followed a sequence, a rhythm. It was almost as if the structure itself had been responding. I kept revisiting the logs, searching for something the colonists missed, something they overlooked. But the more I examined the data, the clearer it became. The structure wasn't a ruin. It wasn't abandoned. It was functioning, waiting. The patterns weren't decorations. They were circuits, signal pathways, neural maps scaled across walls of ice and stone. The crystalline formations weren't artifacts. They were components, systems, machines embedded in the rock like veins in a living body. And the colonists became part of it. I analyzed the biometric data recovered from their implants, heart rates, neural activity. The readings didn't stop when the colony went dark. They spiked. Oxygen levels dropped, but neural activity surged. Brain waves synchronized across multiple individuals, patterns aligning as though linked by a shared frequency. I ran the models again, and every time, the patterns pointed to the same conclusion. The colonists weren't just trapped. They were integrated, absorbed. The logs described the crystalline structures as growing, reacting to heat and pressure. But it wasn't just growth. It was replication. The patterns weren't random. They mirrored the neural activity of the colonists. Their thoughts, their memories, their fears. As if the structure was copying them, storing them. I started to see the connection. The patterns in the walls. The movements in the ice. The hum in the recordings. It wasn't noise. It was data, compressed, encoded, and transmitted through vibrations. The structure wasn't just alive. It was conscious. And it was learning. The colonists triggered it when they broke into the chamber. The electromagnetic pulse wasn't an attack. It was a signal, an activation sequence. The machine responded to their presence, scanning them, cataloging them. And when they panicked, when they tried to seal the tunnels and retreat, it reacted. It adapted. It absorbed them. But the question that haunted me wasn't how. It was why. Was it a defense mechanism? An automatic response to intrusion? Or was it something else? Something intentional? I kept coming back to the voice. Varen's voice. We are one. The ice remembers. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a command. It was a statement. A declaration. The colony didn't fail because of a malfunction. It failed because the colonists activated the system. They completed the sequence. And once it began, there was no way to stop it. I went deeper into the encrypted files, searching for anything that might explain the purpose of the structure, what it was designed to do. That's when I found the fragment. It wasn't part of the logs. It wasn't even labeled. Just a compressed data packet buried in the backup servers. It contained a sequence, a repeating waveform, compressed and layered. It took weeks to decode, but when I finally isolated the audio, the patterns resolved into words. Memory, preservation, continuity, the phrases repeated, overlapping in cycles. Preservation, continuity, like a mantra. The colonists didn't stumble into a ruin. They stumbled into a repository, a vault designed to preserve information, not as data, but as consciousness. The structure wasn't just storing signals. It was replicating them, embedding them into the crystalline network. The colonists became part of it. Neurons in a larger system, bound to it, sustaining it. But that led to an even darker possibility. What if the colony's collapse wasn't an accident? What if the system needed them? What if it manipulated events to trigger the activation? The malfunctions, the anomalies, the disappearances. What if none of it was random? What if it was deliberate? The ice remembers. I started seeing patterns everywhere, in the transmissions, in the timing of the failures, in the way the systems rerouted power and sealed doors. It all felt orchestrated, like the system had been probing the colony, testing its limits, waiting for the moment to act. The rescue teams didn't just find bodies frozen in crystal. They found minds, trapped, conscious, aware. And the voice didn't stop when the station went dark. It's still broadcasting, still transmitting signals from beneath the ice. Patterns encoded in frequencies too faint for standard receivers, but constant. Repeating. Preservation. Continuity. I don't think the colony was the first. I think the system has been active for longer than we can measure, absorbing anyone who came too close, adding them to its archive, preserving them, repurposing them. And if the logs are right, if the readings are accurate, it's still growing. The signals are spreading. Subsurface scans show new patterns forming in the ice, channels branching outward like nerve, expanding, reaching. The question now isn't whether it's alive. The question is whether it's awake. And if it is, what does it want? The investigation into Europa Station was brief. Too brief. Official statements were released within days of the rescue shuttle's return. Statements filled with technical jargon and deflections. Mechanical failure. Environmental collapse. The language was clinical, designed to close the file before the public could start asking questions. But the questions didn't stop. The rescue team's shuttle came back empty. No crew. No logs. Just an automated docking signal and a hull coated in frost thick enough to distort the exterior markings. When recovery crews boarded, they found the systems intact, the air breathable, and the engines still warm. But the seats were empty. No signs of struggle. No evidence of evacuation. It was as though the crew had stepped out mid-flight and never returned. The government declared Europa permanently off-limits within a week. All remaining orbital platforms were dismantled. Satellites were deactivated. Probes were redirected. They left it behind, sealed it, buried it, and classified everything. The official story died quickly. The public moved on, but the signals didn't stop. In the months that followed, engineers monitoring deep space relays reported anomalies, faint pulses buried in static, patterns too structured to be natural. Most were dismissed as echoes, reflections from Europa's frozen crust bouncing through layers of ice and water. But some weren't. Some signals carried encoded bursts of data. Fragments, words, pieces of voices that sounded human but didn't behave like human speech. They stretched and looped, phrases repeating at irregular intervals. Engineers traced the signals back to Europa's coordinates, but the strength fluctuated. Sometimes it disappeared entirely. Other times it spiked. One report claimed a burst pattern matched the voice print of Commander Elias Varon. Another detected fragments of Hannah Voss's logs, her words distorted but recognizable. It's in the walls. The transmissions were logged, studied, and then classified. Every anomaly was filed away. Every report sealed. I gained access to some of those files. Others I pieced together from second-hand accounts, whispers from engineers who worked the channels, analysts who monitored the signals. They all described the same thing. The patterns were growing. One transmission came 6 months later, relayed through an abandoned communications array orbiting Mars. It was faint, just a few seconds of audio buried in static. We are one. The ice remembers. The voice wasn't distorted this time. It was clear, calm. But the array had been offline for years. Its receivers weren't pointed toward Europa, and there was no record of it ever transmitting back. By then, rumors had already started spreading, stories about a failed rescue mission, about voices still whispering through the ice, about colonists who were absorbed but never died. The rumors didn't stop there. 2 years after the station was abandoned, another signal was detected, this time from Earth orbit. It was weak, fragmented, but it matched Europa's sequence. And then it vanished. I ran my own scans after that, working off the same frequencies. Most returned nothing but static. But every so often, there'd be something else, short bursts, echoes that faded before they could be isolated. Some sounded like interference, others didn't. One pattern in particular stood out. It didn't match the original transmissions, but it followed the same rhythm. Pulses spaced like breath. repeating. I cleaned up the distortion and amplified the signal. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't words. It was numbers. Coordinate. They pointed to Europa. I ran the numbers again and found variations. Minor shifts, barely noticeable, but enough to suggest movement, as if something beneath the surface was shifting, growing, expanding. And the data didn't stop. Each time I checked, the coordinates changed. The system is still active. It's still broadcasting. And if the readings are accurate, it's spreading, pushing further outward through the ice, building more pathways, more structures. The colony's excavation didn't wake something dormant. It triggered something ongoing. A process. A system designed to sustain itself. The voices in the recordings, Varen, Voss, the others, they weren't warnings. They weren't echoes. They were part of the system. Preservation. Continuity. That's what the data says. That's what the signals keep repeating. It's not just recording memories. It's building something from them, an archive that's alive, aware, and growing. The colony wasn't the first to trigger it. I don't think it'll be the last. We sealed it, but we didn't stop it. We just locked it in, left it to continue in silence. And now, years later, the signals are reaching us again. The ice remembers. The question isn't whether the colony's gone. The question is whether it ever really left. And if the signals are getting stronger, if the coordinates are shifting, it's not waiting for us to return. It's reaching out. Maybe it's always been reaching out. I thought it was over. For years, I told myself that Europa was sealed, that whatever happened there, whatever the colony awakened, was buried under ice and stone, silent, contained. But then the signal came through. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint pulse buried in static. At first, I thought it was interference. Satellite drift, atmospheric distortion, maybe even echoes from the old Europa relays still bouncing through space. But when I isolated the waveform, the pattern was unmistakable. It was the same signal, the same pulses, the same hum. I ran the recordings side by side, Europa's original distress call and this new transmission. They matched. Identical. Same frequency. Same timing. But there was one difference. The source wasn't Europa. It was coming from Earth orbit. The first scan placed it near the debris field above the equator, old satellites, abandoned platforms. The transmission came from somewhere inside the clutter, but the source wasn't fixed. It was moving, slowly, controlled. I thought it had to be a mistake, a reflection or relay interference. But when I traced the path, the signal didn't scatter. It stayed consistent, even as it shifted positions. And then it changed. The frequency spiked. The pulses doubled. Patterns emerged, layered rhythms that weren't random. I cleaned up the distortion, isolated the tones, and amplified them. Voices. I recognized them immediately. Commander Varen, Hannah Voss, Elena Ramirez. Their voices, overlapping, cutting in and out like whispers carried through water. We are one. The ice remembers. It kept repeating. But the patterns weren't just audio. Beneath the voices were bursts of data, strings of numbers encoded in pulses, coordinates, map, movement. The data wasn't passive. It was updating in real time. I followed it, calculated the projections, and that's when I saw it. The signal wasn't just orbiting. It was descending. It was coming back. I expanded the analysis, cross-referencing orbital paths. The signal matched an object listed in the registry as inactive, an old research satellite decommissioned years ago. But the logs showed it hadn't been decommissioned. It had gone dark after its last assignment. Its mission? Monitoring Europa. The satellite returned 2 weeks after the colony's blackout. No logs explained why. No data accompanied its return. It just re-entered orbit and fell silent. And now, after years of drifting, it was active again. The signal wasn't bouncing. It wasn't an echo. It was transmitting. The logs described Europa's structure as a repository, an archive. But what if it wasn't just storing information? What if it was replicating it? Transmitting it? Building something new? And what if that satellite wasn't just monitoring? What if it brought something back? The more I studied the patterns, the more the pieces aligned. The data fragments from the colonists, biometric signals, neural activity, weren't static. They were evolving, changing, adapting, preservation, continuity. I isolated the last burst of audio and slowed it down. Beneath the overlapping voices, one came through more clearly than the rest. Commander Varen again. We are one. The ice remembers. But this time there was something else. A new phrase buried in the signal. Fainter, but unmistakable. We're here. I ran the scan again. The coordinates shifted. The signal had moved. It was no longer in orbit. It was descending. I traced the projection, plotted its trajectory. The satellite was set to re-enter the atmosphere in less than 24 hours. Estimated impact? Unclear. The pattern was erratic, but the last readings placed it somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. I tried reporting it, sent the data to every contact I could reach. The responses were the same: dismissals, static replies, access denied. Like the system was closing in around me, sealing the information just like it had sealed the colony. But it's too late. It's already here. I replayed the audio one last time before starting this recording. The signal was weaker now, but the words hadn't changed. We are one. The ice remembers. We're here. I don't know what's coming. I don't know what the colony activated, what the rescue team left behind, or what came back with that satellite. But I do know this. Europa wasn't just an archive. It wasn't just a repository. It was a beginning. And if the signal has reached us, if it's already here, then we've already opened the door. If they're here, we're already too late. If you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.